So I've had my original Xtool D1 laser for several months now, and it's really become one of my daily use lasers for just about everything that requires quick portable engraving. Now, while I love that laser, Xtool sent me this one. This is the Xtool D1 Pro, and this happens to be the 20-watt version. Now, what I wanted to really do is put this laser through its paces, and if you really want to find out what makes it a pro, then stick around. How's it going, everybody? Steve here, and welcome to the shop. Now, I don't want to banter too long at the beginning of this video because there's honestly a lot to cover here. So what I'm going to do is I'll skip the usual kind of assembly because it's really, I don't know, 8 bolts to put in. It's pretty quick to put together, and there's lots of other videos around that. But I will talk about some of the kind of high-level details. I'll do a bit of a flyover here to show you why this laser is at the top of the market. This laser is not cheap. I'll warn you in advance, but there's a reason it's not cheap, and we'll talk about those. Then I'll do a bit of testing, and I'll show you some of the results here, particularly what 20 watts can do for you versus 10 or even 5 watts. And we'll come up with an assessment at the end, and I'll talk about things I think that are really awesome about this laser that will be certainly reasons you want to have one. And a couple of things I think they could have done a bit better. There's still always room for improvement. And with that, we can get started with the flyover here. All right, so we'll start the flyover here with some of the key aspects of the Xtool D1 Pro and generally the Xtool family. So the first one is the use of steel wheels and rods rather than those polyurethane wheels or plastic wheels. And that makes a huge difference. You can see they slide very smoothly. The wheels they look great, and you know, they're going to last a lifetime. This is one of the things that makes the Xtool D1 Pro or Xtool lasers in general more commercial grade, we'll say. So the next big advantage of the Xtool D1 Pro and the Xtool family in general is the way they run the belts for the steppers to drive the X and Y axis. And the cabinet for the laser, the frame, is basically a C channel of aluminum. So they actually tuck the belts inside the frame so they stay out of the way. Now, they also have this nice way to adjust them. You can loosen off that screw and tighten the belt and then tighten that screw back up to lock it down. Now, there is that big braided cable that runs all the power for the stepper motors in the laser, and that actually has some potential to get in the way, and I'll talk a bit more about that as we go. Now, one distinct advantage of the Xtool D1 Pro over previous Xtool lasers is that it provides limit switches. Now, these limit switches aren't actually switches, they're optocouplers, and you can see one there. And there's an optocoupler on both sides of that little module. And when the laser moves back and forth or side to side, you can see it hits that little black metal flange sticking out, and that blocks the beam, and that tells the laser when it's at the home position or at the extreme end on both the X and Y axis. So another thing that sets this particular laser apart in the Xtool D1 family is that it uses a full 20-watt laser module. And the way they do that is they take 4 5-watt diode lasers running inside that fairly impressive metal can and merge them together using some creative optics to create a single beam. And what that beam allows you to do certainly is all the engraving you could do with any other laser, but in addition to that, you get this huge ability for cutting, and particularly wood, of course, but I mean, it's rivaling, if not exceeding, some CO2 lasers, so you would not expect it, and I'll show you in the results what that really means. Now, as with any laser, you need to be able to focus this one, and the way Xtool did that was they migrated the focusing from the previous Xtool D1 10-watt laser module. So you still have that thumb screw on the left side where you can loosen it off, and then on the right side you can pop down the height adjustment and drop the laser module down until that touches your material, and then tighten the screw up on the left side and your laser's in focus. It takes a second. Now, they do on this module have a second knob on the right side, and if you loosen that one off, what it allows you to do is adjust in a finer grain the height for the focus. So you can focus and then you can adjust the laser up a few millimeters. And what that allows you to do, or where it's handy, is if you're doing something like engraving and you want to have a wider dispersion on the beam so that it's not cutting so harshly. You can raise it up a bit and you'll get a little softer focus and make your engraving look a little cleaner. Last thing we need to talk about here is how to get the laser connected to the outside world. Now, fortunately, Xtool has put all of the connection bits on the right-hand side of the laser. So you have the on-off switches there, the power cable, the USB cable, and if you're connecting to Wi-Fi, there's a Wi-Fi antenna underneath all of this on the bottom of the frame. So everything is nicely out of the way, and it's really just the perfect setup. Previous lasers in the Xtool D1 family used a piece of software called LaserBox Basic, and what it's for is for doing shape layout or image layout, material selection, and starting an engrave or a cut job. And it worked okay. It was a little basic, and given that this laser is at the high end of the market, it was probably more basic than the audience the laser was targeted for. Now, if it's your absolute first laser and you've never turned one on before, this is a fine piece of software, LaserBox Basic. But they've come up with this new one for the D1 Pros called Xtool Creative Space, and it's much more, friendly to higher end users and maybe people who are running a small business, a small engraving business. And here's what it looks like. When I first started it up, I had to go detect my laser, and it found it's a USB on the USB line. Now this laser, every time I run XCS, the creative space, it will go find my laser. So I don't have to ever do this again. And if I want to do some additional settings, I can click the settings here. There's some working parameters. I can turn things like the limit switches off. So basic stuff, but makes it quite powerful. And as far as layout, so it will let me do things like layout an image, so I can stick my dog on there. And this is a photo off my camera, so it's fairly large. So I can tell it to just scale to the canvas for the workspace, and I can scale it. I can certainly adjust it if I wanted to create a different aspect ratio, or I can go up here and I can say, look, I want this thing to be 75 millimeters tall, and there you go. Now I could also do things like insert a rectangle around it, and maybe put a piece of text on here. And there we go. So fairly quickly I can create an image. I can do a bunch of more powerful things. So I can align everything to the center, and so it's now perfectly aligned. And when I'm ready, I can hit the process, and that will send it off to the laser. It will go out and estimate some time, says this is going to be 17 minutes. And I can frame it. I could just say, yeah, okay, start, and it would go. I won't start it here because it's sitting on my workbench and I don't want to cut holes in my mat. So very simple, and but still powerful, and it can do most of the really basic layout things that Lightburn can do. So unless you're doing something like a power scale, and you've seen me show them, and I'll show another one here in the results, where you have speed versus power, and every column is a different level of power. Lightburn does that with ease. It's much more difficult here, but that's not a typical use case for the average user. So with this, you can just quickly whip things up and get going, and it's free, which is the nicest part of it. So that's XCS. You're definitely going to want to have this on your computer when you plug your laser in, because periodically you're going to want to check for updates, and with the Xtool D1, this is the only way to do that. So we can take a quick look at some results here. Now I did the standard power test twice. The first test was from 1,000 millimeters per minute up to 10,000, and that's just a little too slow for the D1 Pro 20 watt. So I used my higher speed test, so it goes from 1,800 up to 18,000 millimeters per minute, and in both cases you can see it did a pretty good job. Notably, of course, the absence of pretty much anything going on around the 10% level. It It's just a behavior of this particular laser module, very similar to the original D1. And there's really no issue with that because there's certainly lots of power at the high end. So if you go from the lowest kind of power up to the highest, you can see there's quite a contrast there. So no big deal, but it is interesting that it exhibits that behavior. So next I tried my standard grayscale test on black acrylic. And again, not a bad job. It doesn't handle grayscale all that well. I could certainly play around with the settings and probably get that a bit better, but it's there, but it's not certainly as good as the LaserMaster 3. But if you change from grayscale to something like Jarvis or Stucky, and this is a piece of cherry, I used Jarvis rendering on this, and you can see it did just a fantastic job. The horizontal lines there are the grain in the wood, of course. Now, I probably could have used a little less power and got a bit better, but if you look around the rock, which is usually what I look at in this particular test, particularly here where you can see a nice gradient from almost white down to almost black. So very nice. Then I used my typical logo test. It's the exact logo I use on my projects, a cutting board or something, for example. And I typically use on the D1, the original D1, 6,000 millimeters per minute at 100% power. And you can see on the 20 watt, it did a fairly harsh job. There's a lot of definitely depth to these cuts, and it's practically burnt through on MDF, which is quite a feat. So there's two ways to solve that. You can either maybe double the speed or chop the power down. I opted to chop the power down to about 40%, and it did a much nicer job. Most of the smoke you see here is actually from this one. I had the air purposely turned off here because I wanted to see what the engraving looked like without air assist. And it did a much better job. You can actually see the different shade of the pie slice. Now, by contrast, the D1, the original D1 with the same settings on MDF looks like this. And again, not bad, but you can discern the pie slice, but it's definitely not as nice as this. So very, very good job engraving standard images as well. Now, of course, a 20 watt laser would be nothing without the ability to cut. So I did my standard cut test. And again, the purpose of this test isn't to see if it can chop through. It's to say with a reasonable setting with 1 pass, 2 pass, 3 pass, or 4 pass, how deep does it cut through with each pass? And the original D1 without air assist, you could see it was kind of fuzzy and it didn't actually cut through anywhere with 1, 2, 3, or 4 passes. The OLM3, the LaserMaster 3, was able to cut through with 4 passes. Now the Xtool D1 with the exact same settings, the Pro, certainly 4 passes was a given. 3 passes, I thought, yeah, that's not really a surprise. 2 passes, 1 pass. And this is solid 1/4 inch maple. So this is hard stuff. And I was just really impressed. And again, I wasn't trying to cut through. It was really a test to see the difference in depth from one pass to the next. So very, very impressive. Not to be outdone, I started with a piece of, this is 1x2 pine, local hardware store pine, and this is a single pass through almost 20 millimeters of solid pine. So it's about 2 millimeters per second at 100% power, and just scissored through this stuff really, really quick. And you'll see, I'll post some video of the actual cut there. And then to really see if it was worth its weight, I tried a 1/2 inch hardware store plywood, and this stuff is loaded with glue and sometimes nylon cord in between layers. And again, single pass, same settings actually as the pine, and it almost cut through. There's about 1.5 layers of the plywood left. So I thought, well, I'll try and break it and see if it did cut clean through. And of course it broke because of that last layer, but that's pretty impressive. Almost with 2 passes, certainly it would just cut through this with no problem. So there you go. That's the results, and I can only say I'm really impressed with both engraving and cutting with this laser. So you saw the results there. They're looking pretty spectacular, and definitely you'll think this is well worth the money for this laser. Now, there's a couple of things I like and I don't like so much about this laser. So on the Pro side, there's definitely fantastic power. That 20-watt laser module is pretty amazing, all things considered. Next on the list here is the addition of limit switches. It's nice that Xtool was listening to its users. So there's actually limits on all 4 corners of the laser frame. So there's no time when you can get, your laser module grinding against the side or the front of the laser frame. So definitely a nice add. And finally here on the Pro side, the improved XCS software, a big advance over LaserBox Basic. And also a nice way to get software updates. In the past Xtool, it was fairly difficult to do software updates unless you were using LaserBox Basic on a regular basis. So it's here now, and you're going to want to have it installed on your machine just to do the updates. So nice touch there. Now on the con side, there's a couple of things I thought around the air assist, and the air assist kind of bugs me a bit. It's nice that it's there, and my laser came with the pump as well, but when I tried to hook up the hose is really stiff plastic rather than a squishy rubber one. So what I did was I just kind of tossed that one aside and I replaced it with a proper rubber hose that's much more flexible. You might want to consider that. And the air assist itself still looks like a bit of an afterthought. The hose runs through that little eye loop at the top of the laser module and then connects into that spigot that comes out the side of the laser module. By contrast, the LaserMaster 3, which I think did it right, they actually pump the air through the laser module right into the nozzle, much more like a CO2 laser would do. So, it just doesn't seem quite as nice as the LaserMaster 3 from that perspective. Anyway, it's nice that they have it and it works really well, but it just kind of looks kludgy. Next on the con list here, I mentioned that there's some potential for cables to snag, those big braided cables that they have. Mine actually was catching on the x-axis, and I ended up cutting off the zip ties that they had pre-mounted there and repositioning the cable so it's out of the way. What it's doing is catching on the hooks that are used for the limit switches, the metal brackets, and I saw it happen on both axes. It was really bad on the x-axis on mine, but you can fix it just by moving the cable. And last on the list here, for a laser that is north of $1,000, it was kind of shocking and still kind of shocking to see that Xtool doesn't enclose their electronics. I don't know about most people's shops. My shop is dusty. I've got saws and planers and sanders going all the time. So there's usually dust floating around, even though I have a central vacuum system and air filter. But it can get dusty in there, and also anything metal that gets near that is a real danger to the controller. So I kind of think for the money that they're charging for this laser, that all those electronics should be enclosed. And you can look at even a $300 laser and see that all the electronics is enclosed in a box. So I think that's something they should really fix. I mean, it's nitpicking, but when you look at the price, you kind of think it should be a little more refined. Anyway, those are the pros and cons. So would I recommend this laser? Without question. I mean, I've already kind of pushed my D1 aside and replaced it with this one. I will certainly use it going forward. Just for cutting, you saw it cut through a 19 millimeter piece of pine in one pass. And that's something that most CO2 lasers can't do. So, it's exceptional. It's not quite a 5 because of some of these cons I mentioned, a 5 out of 5, but it's as close as you can get. And you know, if you've got the money, this one, as I said, is right at the top of the market. But you know, if you've got the budget to spend, or if you're running maybe a small engraving business, this is really the laser to have. So with that, we can wind down. As always, I'll put a video up on the corner here. Go watch that, and I'll see you over there. Otherwise, get out and make your world, and I'll see you next time.